Good afternoon, members of Parliament, support staff, visitors in the public tribune, radio listeners, TV viewers, those viewing via social media, and media members. Welcome to the continuation of this Central Committee meeting number 21, which started during the parliamentary year 2022-23 of today, Thursday, September 14, 2023. A special welcome is extended to the initiative taker, Member of Parliament Rolando Bryson. We have established a quorum of 8 members. Please stand for a moment of silence. Thank you. I have received notice of lateness from MP Sarah Westcott Williams. Are there any other notification? No need. You're a member of Parliament too. MP Bryson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a notification related to what the early agenda point would have been. That is the meeting regarding ECYS. In that meeting, as you know, the minister did not confirm, so we don't have that meeting now. However, our faction, and as well as together with the National Alliance faction, would be presenting some amendments related to that legislation. So we weren't able to present those in the Central Committee today, but we will be doing it in writing instead to the minister so that it will be ready in time for the public handling of that legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, MP Bryson. No more notifications. The agenda point for this Central Committee meeting are: number 1, draft national ordinance laying down rules on higher education and research. That is Higher Education Ordinance under document IS 431/2022-23, dated February 8, 2023, in the parliamentary year 2022-2023-165. And the agenda point 2 is Initiative Draft National Ordinance amending the Permit National Ordinance concerning the trade in drinks and food and the provision of housing with service for a fee in connection with adjusting opening hours and checking noise pollution. Under National Ordinance adjusting opening hours and checking noise pollution, document number IS/588/2020-2021, dated April 16, 2021, under parliamentary year 2020-2021-146. It is good to know that this meeting is a continuation of the meeting adjourned on August 14, 2023, PY 2022-2023. During this meeting, at the handling of the agenda point 1, the Minister of Education, Culture, Youth and Sports, Dr. Rudolph Samuel, gave a presentation, and members of Parliament were allowed to pose questions to the Minister. Agenda point 1 was then adjourned. At the handling of agenda point 2, initiative taker MP Bryson gave a presentation, and members of Parliament asked questions to the initiative taker. Agenda point 2 was then adjourned. It is also good to know that Minister of Education, Culture, Youth and Sport could not be present today to continue with agenda point 1, hence that agenda point will remain adjourned. We will continue handling agenda point 2, which was also adjourned. And the agenda point 2 is Initiative Draft National Ordinance amending the Permit National Ordinance concerning the trade in drinks and food and the provision of housing and service for a fee in connection with adjusting opening hours and checking noise pollution. Under National Ordinance adjusting opening hours and checking noise pollution, the document number is IS/588/2020-2021, dated April 16, 2021. At this time, I give the floor to MP Rolando Bryson to answer the questions the members of Parliament posed on August 14th. MP Bryson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just allow me to plug it out earlier. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you to the members of Parliament for being here today, and a good afternoon to all of you and the viewing public. Mr. Chairman, before I go over to answering the questions, I would also like to state, indeed, you know, I can be very critical sometimes in my work, but the fact is that I have to thank members that are not part of the coalition who are actually here today, as it would be that based on the fact that some of our members are sick today, it is thanks to them that I've received quorum. So to those members, I want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to be able to present this legislation today. All right, enjoy your tea. There were various questions posed. Many of them were common in the, oh, I need to make this. Having a little issue here trying to get. Okay. No. Alvin? Oh, thank you. There were various questions posed, and I just want to handle some of the more common ones first and then go over, Mr. Chairman, into the individual questions. And one of the key points that was brought up consistently, and especially in the media, and I want to be able to clarify this very carefully for the members, is this question about the closing times. As I mentioned in the original presentation, if you look in this legislation, in the chart in front of you, the current legislation, which is the final column, shows what the law states is the maximum closing time that should be granted to supermarkets, other retail, restaurants, bars, and nightclubs and lounges. What I was highlighting, and based on also some of the information that we got from the Council of Advice as well as the Ministry of TIAT, is that obviously these times are no longer in line with the reality that we have in St. Martin. Now what happens is that one of the questions was, does that mean that these businesses are operating illegally? No, because the law also allows the minister to grant exemptions for the ability to a supermarket to operate past 6:30, or a restaurant to operate past midnight, bar past midnight, nightclub past 1 a.m., etc. What, however, we found in discussion with the ministry is that as a result of this, the government, or the ministry in particular, has to constantly grant hundreds or close to 1,000 exemptions for all of these different businesses that are going beyond this time, because it's very common, especially with supermarkets, nightclubs, bars, that they operate beyond the midnight time that was dated back to 1963 in the legislation. So my intention with making the adjustment within this law was really to just minimize the number of, as it's called in Dutch, the ontheffingen. And that was a very specific term that the Council of Advice chose to make the distinction between a vrijstelling, which is a general exemption, and an ontheffing that is given to an individual business. An ontheffing, looking at the guidelines of legislation, should be something exceptional. It should not be something that is done commonly. If you compare that, for example, in the building permit ordinance, there are chances where you give this exemption, this ontheffing, but it is not intended that, you know, if there's 1,000 building permits, that let's say 400 of them are granted exemptions to build outside of the building code. It should be a very exceptional circumstance. However, hearing the feedback from the members of parliament and, of course, the community, I want to make sure that there is no confusion about the intention behind the law. So I want to be very clear. The intention behind it was never and is never to allow nightclubs or bars to all open until 5 a.m. And to further ensure that there's no such confusion in the future, if you look at the chart, what we did is we did a study of the different closing times, and we found a median closing time for bars and a median closing time for nightclubs. What we then looked at is if we take then the average of those two, that would mean 3 a.m. And when you look at the number of exemptions that would have to be granted for those businesses that would be allowed to open past 3 a.m., then the number of exemptions that would have to be granted would be much smaller. So for that reason, I will be submitting a note of amendment that will change the hours, which now, just to be clear, supermarkets, actually it's not 2 a.m., that's a typo, 3 a.m. Supermarkets adjusted to 10 p.m., restaurants to 1 a.m., coffee houses, so that would be nightclubs and bars, max closing time 3 a.m., and that there would still be the exemption rule that would exist, so the sort of minister's discretion, and that businesses would have the opportunity to be heard before a change is made to their license. Last time I said that it does not mean that if it's 5 a.m., every business can close, but now I also don't want to create a new confusion that if we say 3 a.m. is the latest time, that means no business would be allowed to be granted an exemption past that time. So it will still be the discretionary power of a minister to allow a business to, as is done right now, to open past any of the specific times that would be listed in the law. Okay. So with that, I would go over to the specific questions where I once again will explain maybe in more detail some of these points. From the questions of MP Ludmila de Weaver, one of the questions was in terms of stakeholder consultations, what level of stakeholder consultations were had. One of the things that were done, of course, was within the industry itself. So restaurants, bars, supermarkets, and so on, there were consultations with that. But in particular, her question would be, for example, to hotels. I did speak to 3 different hotels, and indeed, their concern is more so the noise pollution in terms of the fact that there is no clear guideline, as I highlighted in the first round of this committee meeting, that there's conflicting policy, that there is not a clear guideline that the businesses are held to. So their concern is not even so much just the opening time, because they also say even at 9 p.m., 10 p.m., the noise pollution is extreme. So they do believe that it should not just be based, let's say, until X amount of time you could play X decibels, because there are some people that might not even necessarily want to go to sleep, but they want to relax in their room. So there should be a general accepted norm that this law would allow to be published by national decree containing general measures, that it will be clear that this is the sound volume that should be emitting, maximum amount that should be emitting from your establishment. And I believe that this new norm, once established by national decree, would significantly help with the noise complaints. And the stakeholders did agree. They think that if there's something to be held by, that would be easier. One of them also mentioned that they were in litigation with a bar and restaurant close to them, and they actually lost the court case as a result of the fact that there was no exact clear guideline, as was mentioned in that judgment, that states that he should be at the bar and restaurant in question close to the hotel should be at a particular decibel, just that from a public, from a public perspective, that it should be reasonable. What the hotel was trying to have the judge do is impose a specific decibel limit, because that would allow their own controllers to be able to measure the sound level and then send the reports to the Ministry of TIAT. But that they were not successful in that sense. So now with this legislation, I hope now that a clear policy would be given on what the sound levels should be emitted from the location of these businesses. So the main goal of the legislation is really to finally give the authority by means of this national ordinance to create a national decree where all of these sound levels for these businesses will now be very specifically regulated. One of the questions also from MP De Weaver was, does this law address the issue of private businesses or for private individuals or cars and others still being able to play loud music? The music tends to travel over the lagoon, so the Simpson Bay is especially an area sensitive to that. For the first part of the question, no. This legislation deals specifically with all of the type of businesses within the licensing ordinance, the vergunning Landsverordening, which are hotels, supermarkets, bars, nightclubs, etc. I do believe that on a broader scale, maybe on a national level, that is something that should be included in some other legislation. But that was beyond the scope of the legislation that I have brought forward, because I'm amending an existing law. And that law is designed to specifically oversee those type of businesses. So I'm not able to say, well, also from someone's home, they shouldn't be playing that level of music. However, the Ministry of TIAT receives 73% of the complaints that it receives are from businesses. That is not to say that it's not a significant number coming from other sources, but at least the information we have is that at least 77% or 71% of the complaints, which are coming from mostly these type of businesses, will be better addressed by means of this legislation. The question regarding the why 5 a.m., I think I explained that earlier. So once again, to be clear, and Mr. Chairman, if maybe I can address to my good friends at the Daily Herald, Gordon, Judy, how are y'all doing? If you want to quote very clearly, I am not in favor of all businesses in St. Martin, absolutely not opening till 5 a.m. And as a matter of fact, a note of amendment to make sure, clarify and solidify that is going to be presented before the public meeting. The next question from MP De Weaver was, why should restaurants be allowed to play music? That is something that she thinks is concerning. Restaurants are there to be able to serve food. Mr. Chairman, I respectfully disagree with the Member of Parliament. I think the industry has evolved significantly, not just in St. Martin, but globally. Restaurants are trying to remain competitive. It is especially in these economic times, they need to be able to add entertainment to their lineup to be able to attract patrons to it. And if some businesses are doing it and some don't tap into it, then they fall out of competition and you have an imbalance in the industry. So the fact that some restaurants are being allowed to play music and some not, that is, I think, unfair for the industry. However, that is why, again, the regulation for noise pollution has to come from a national decree before that is implemented. So simultaneously with allowing restaurants to be able to play some music, there needs to be very clear guidelines, which I believe this legislation will be able to allow for that to be put in place. So while I understand the perspective of the Member of Parliament, that restaurants were originally given a license, let's say, just to serve food, but you have many restaurants now like Pineapple Pete and Sale Pepe, Bamboo Bernie's, et cetera, that at least once during the week, in some cases, they have different theme nights. Maybe tonight is jazz, next time is local music, etc. They are adding entertainment not because they necessarily just want to make noise. They really just want to make ends meet. So I think our role then is to see how we can facilitate that in a manner that it doesn't disturb the community, and that is where the noise levels come into play. One of the questions was why the need for this legislative change? Can't the government do this on their own? Mr. Chairman, that was actually one of the questions I posed to the Ministry of TIAT before initiating this law, and it was the response to that question that really prompted me to say no. We have a legislative issue here, not just an enforcement issue. There was a letter that I received as a response. I don't have the exact IS number, but it's dated the 5th of April 2021, in which I posed to then Minister of TIAT De Weaver. And my question was, does the ministry also share the opinion that currently within the legislation that falls under the Ministry of TIAT, there is no legislation that regulates noise levels? And the answer was, yes, we agree that there is currently no legislation that regulates noise levels. However, based on external legal advice and review, this is also the case for Aruba and Curacao. Furthermore, Article 52 of the Landsverordening prohibits hospitality businesses from playing music or from having dancing or other activities for the entertainment of the public without express permission from the Minister of TIAT after having heard the Minister of Justice. So what the response is that, is there legislation for sound levels? No. The answer was clear. There is no legislation giving the ministry authority to really clearly be able to set sound levels on licenses or on a decree level, a ministerial regulation. That authority does not exist according to the ministry at the time, and my research did confirm that. What the minister was referring to at the time in terms of Article 52, which is what I mentioned, is still very ambiguous because at that time it says any music. So to play any music, you would need permission from both the Minister of TIAT and the Minister of Justice. But that is a very vague situation, and that's why I wanted to also amend Article 52, because it means that if somebody just has the radio on and is within their play and playing music within the supermarket, the hotel, and etc., it's totally impractical to then expect that they would have to go through that entire process of asking justice and TIAT, etc. I think that's just a very antiquated way of maybe how that was reasonable back in 1963 when it was much smaller, when you had approximately maybe 10 to 20 of these type of businesses. Now we have much more. So I think there was a clear need for legislation that was outlined by the government. Further to that discussion, her successor, Mr. Roger Lawrence, I had a meeting with him also on this, and the discussion was, you know, I would like to do this initiative law, or would the ministry like to take it over? But having the opportunity to discuss with the ministry and seeing that they are able to provide me the necessary information, and I was already far along with the legislation, it was agreed that I would continue with that, and that the minister at the time did commit to offering whatever resources and information I needed from the ministry to answer, for example, the questions from the Council of Advice, or to answer the questions of the Honorable Minister of Parliament, members of Parliament, and the ministry has been very supportive in that regard. The next question. The Member of Parliament, the Weaver, also asked why combine the law, so why are we addressing noise pollution and the opening times within this law? This legislation, the vergoeding Landsverordening, addresses both. I saw an issue on the exemption side of things, which I've addressed a little bit before, that I think needed to also be tweaked, which has been done in the legislation, but the essence of what I really wanted to do with this legislation, or at least my focus, was really the noise pollution issue. It is a problem in our country, and this is an effort to try to fix it. So it is, to answer the question specifically, the law handles both aspects, opening times and noise pollution, and I've decided to amend both. Moving to the question of Member of Parliament Gubbs, Mr. Chairman. Is there indeed an abundance of exemptions? Going back to the email and the list of questions that I had posed to the Minister of TIAT at the time, how many business licenses has the ability / exemption written into their license to open past the hours prescribed by law? And the answer was, from a total of 789 operational licenses issued up to March 2021, which are businesses with licenses to operate bars and restaurants, a total of 300 licenses were issued to open past midnight. This represents a total of 38% of all operational licenses and for bars and restaurants. So this figure, of course, may have changed since then, but it gives you an idea that 30% of businesses are being granted exemptions. And in my opinion, that is very high. I think now that we've made the adjustments where, for example, a lot of those, this doesn't count, for example, supermarkets. The law says most supermarkets should close at 6:30. Most do not close. I don't think any supermarket closes at 6:30. So you probably have another close to 100 of those there. So there's a lot of exemptions being granted that, in my opinion, are not necessary. And by adjusting the opening hours, as I presented earlier, I think we will be able to limit those exemptions. I would like also the members of Parliament to consider the heavy bureaucracy involved, because this is done on an annual basis to confirm those exemptions. It's not something you get on your license one and all. These exemptions are checked every year by the department, and different requests come in. So the bureaucracy involved in granting so many exemptions is also high. So for that reason, as I mentioned earlier, is why we wanted to make that adjustment. Also, the question was posed by MP Gums about the closing time. She actually made the suggestion about, 3 a.m. is probably more realistic, and I have taken up that suggestion within the legislation. She made the example that there are some businesses that close until 4 a.m., but considered to be appropriate in terms of how they handle noise pollution, because, for example, like Lotus, that is closed. I think I agree with that. I think for businesses that are closed and are soundproof, you won't get any noise complaints. But interestingly, though, Lotus, on the opening hours side, did have issues in the past in being able to get the exemption that they now have to go until 4 a.m. because they would actually, to go past midnight, technically they would have to close at midnight, which would not be sustainable to their business. They too then had to ask for an exemption, and when they were first reopening, because people might not know, that was the former Tantra nightclub in Maho. They wanted to reopen as Lotus in Simpson Bay, and one of the challenges in being able to reopen was being granted their exemption that they would have needed to fix their business model. So it does show that having the exemption there, it can cause a lot of stress to businesses when they're waiting months or if not years to be able to grant the exemption they need to be able to operate as a business. But since that exemption has been granted, Lotus indeed does open till 4 a.m. Mention was made, for example, of a sort of a last call for alcohol provision by MP Gums, and actually I did agree with that. I actually tried to legislate that into the original draft. However, the Council of Advice did find some serious concerns about it. To summarize that, really, first of all, that would have to be done in coordination with justice. So perhaps this might not be the right place to place such a last call for alcohol exemption. Just to explain what that means, in some countries, although a business is allowed to open till, let's say, 3 a.m., you're not allowed to serve alcohol past a certain time. I believe in the city of Toronto, for example, you can go to a nightclub till 4 a.m., but I believe they stop serving at maybe at 12. Yeah, they stop serving very early. And it is an interesting idea because it does contribute to road safety. You have people that can have their liquor, but then there's a cool down period before you go into your vehicle and drive the cars. It also, what has happened from an economic perspective for Toronto is that people tend to go out earlier now. So economically, it's better for the businesses because instead of walking into the club at 1 o'clock in the morning, they're going to say, all right, well, let me get there by 10 or 11, and then after I can enjoy the rest of the night. I did try to implement that into the legislation. Maybe I wasn't technically proficient to be able to do it, or for whatever reason, I just felt like, let me follow the advice of the Council of Advice and take it out. However, if other members of parliament or maybe the government itself would like to implement something like that, the Council of Advice, in advising this law, has already pointed out what would be necessary if we want to implement something like that in St. Martin. Personally, it is something that I would definitely welcome. Did we consult with community councils? I must say no, I did not consult with the community councils. I do think that the level of consultation in terms of the details regarding noise pollution would have to be done by the government before they establish the national decree. Because remember, the brunt of this legislation from a noise pollution perspective is really creating the legal basis for government to set the standard. So the consultation level of what district should have what level and so on, I think that the government has to do that. And that ties into another question from both MP Gums and MP Westcott Williams as to why a national decree. I think a national decree containing general measures is appropriate because this is something that's going to involve multiple ministries. The Ministry of Rummy, Ministry of Justice, and Ministry of TIAT come to mind. So coming back to the point about community councils, no, I did not have that consultation, but I do think it's something that the government would have to do when they implement the sound levels. The Member of Parliament also made the suggestion about, rather than having the measuring distance from where the inspectors would measure the sound, rather than having 30 meters, which was a standard, I kind of looked at other country standards, but she did bring up the good point about the fact that St. Martin is built very different. We have very mixed societies in terms of the commercial and residential being very mixed. So the suggestion that she made regarding making it 30 meters or the closest facade is something well received, and it is something that I will implement and amend into the law. So in other words, instead of just saying it's 30 meters away, period, it's 30 meters or the closest facade, which is defined as the border of the nearest building. So in that case, basically, in most cases, you would go to the closest building, stand at the border of it, and then you would measure from there the sound of the other establishment that you're trying to enforce. So that would mean two changes that would be coming, no longer 5 a.m. and closest facade as opposed to 30 meters. Have we considered restaurants providing music and what effects this would have? Indeed, I think I touched on that a little bit. and I do think maybe this is more of a philosophical discussion. Economically, I do think that the industry is evolving. Locals have opportunities to perform there, and I think it's something that we should allow, but we should regulate, which this law does implement. Next to the questions of MP Westcott Williams, in how far is the overall objective of this law being met? Admittedly, not fully, because now when you initiate a law, you have the consultations with the ministry, you have consultations with the legal department, let's say here, the Griffier from a technical perspective, and then you get the advice from the Council of Advice. And the law has transformed a lot since then. Would we have maybe wanted to eradicate exemptions? Yes, but if that was the goal, no, that goal isn't met. But what I do believe we've done by being able to scale, rescale the maximum opening times, we can definitely significantly reduce the number of exemptions that the ministry has to give. The Member of Parliament stated I think the discretionary power is one that she wrestled with the most, and I did as well. Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, what the Member of Parliament is referring to is the discretionary power of a minister to decide on their own what time a business should close or open. And on the one hand, I do believe that we have to allow our ministers to take informed decisions as to whatever circumstances are there and take a decision that they believe is best for our economy and our society. But on the other hand, I'm very worried about maybe potential abuse of said discretionary power, the challenges and that can give to businesses where you invest into a business with a mind that, okay, this year my license is granted and I'm allowed to open till 1 a.m. And the new minister comes in and just suddenly decides, you know what, no, I think you need to close at 11 p.m. That discretionary power, I'm not saying that's something that has happened or is happening, but it's something that's possible. It's something that has happened. And I think by being able to limit where the discretions comes in or needs to be used, we can help with that a bit. Also, what helps with that significantly is the clause that I've added to Article 47, where before changing a person's time on their license, they have an opportunity to be heard. I think that does a couple of things. The 4-week period where you can be heard, you can present your arguments as to, well, Minister, you want to limit my time to something earlier. This is the damage it's going to do to the business. Or instead of going that early, can we maybe go a little bit later? And then from that perspective, it also gives them some sort of legal argument if they want to pursue it in courts or even to the ombudsman, that they can say, look, I have issued my complaint to the ministry. They haven't answered me. I'm here in limbo. I need action. Ombudsman, can you help me? Or courts, can you help me? I think by putting that clause in, we help also balance the discretionary power of ministers. The Member of Parliament asked, why no financial means when the government's, what about the financial means when the government says it cannot do the enforcement for the plastic bag ban? Also a very interesting question, because indeed one of the laws that we've passed in Parliament, initiative law from MP Westcott Williams, was that we want to ban plastic bags in St. Martin. And then the response that we get from the government is that, well, we can't enforce that. I was very careful to ask the ministry about this, and it seems to be that the difference is that with plastic bags, the enforcement of that is on the import, on the sale, or whatever. I don't want to comment too much because that's not necessarily my legislation. But in terms of the enforcement of, let me go back to the plastic. That is a new enforcement. That was something new that would have to be enforced. But the ministry is already doing its checks. What will happen now is that they just have more teeth, so to speak, to be able to say, this is the regulation stated in the national decree, you are over, this is your first warning, this is your second warning, this is your first fine, this is your second fine. It will now just make it easier for the inspectors to do their jobs. I also think it might put a bit of a burden less on the police, because the instinct of most citizens is to call the police when a business is doing too much noise. Instead now, the inspectors will have the authority and the know-how within that national decree to go and regulate this on their own, where the police can get involved if the person is maybe unruly or the business refuses to act. But now our TIAT inspectors, a very large and important department within our government, will have something stronger to act on. The Member of Parliament asked what percentage of licenses. I mentioned that earlier in response to MP De Weaver. It's approximately 30% of licenses are granted exemptions. The question about national decree versus ministerial decree was answered in response to MP Gums. National decree can involve the entire government, so we get all their perspective. Did the ministry give any reason why there are conflicting policy? The information I have is that the residential economic policy and the enforcement policy are separate policies that handle more than just noise pollution. However, so in their own respective aspects where they enforce other things, it works out fine. The issue is that the enforcement policy has one regulation for sound levels, the rep has another regulation for sound level. That's a conflicting standard. So this national decree would then be able to resolve that conflict. So the national decree would be higher than a unpublished policy, so it would be clear that that is what has to be followed. Is the minister or businesses acting in contravention of the law if they are surpassing those times? No, that is not the case. Businesses are allowed to open past the time if they receive the exemption in the current state of affairs, and the minister is allowed by the law, I think it's sub 4 of Article 47, to be able to give that exemption, but like I keep saying, the exemptions have become the norm rather than exemptions. MP Peterson commented quite a lot on the Council Advice report, and I could answer his questions by basically just saying, I agree. Look, the Council of Advice has looked at the legislation and found many things wrong with it. And their advice is, before you bring this to the floor of Parliament, these things have to be sufficiently addressed. And I believe I've taken the effort within the NADA report, but also between the law itself, to address those issues. So of course, mentioning again that it needed to have more motivation for the reasoning as to why we use this sound level or not, that was addressed. The change of the name within closing time to opening time, indeed that was addressed. Apparently within the aanbieding brief, it still had opening times instead of sluitingstijd. So I thank the Member of Parliament to point that one out. So that will be changed in the aanbieding brief, so that for the record, the title in the law is correct. There were other technical suggestions that the Member of Parliament did. For example, under Dale versus Lit, those adjustments would indeed be made as well. So that would be the third adjustment that Members of Parliament can expect to the law that will come to the public meeting. He commented on the fact as to whether there's a notzak when doing legislation. You need to establish if there a need for it. Well, I think the ministry has indicated to Parliament that there is a need for it. They have indicated that there is insufficient legislation. So my answer would be yes, there is a need for this, and this law does help with noise pollution especially, and dealing with the large number of exemptions. The question about the times, I've already addressed several times. The Member of Parliament had questions about that. There was also a technical comment on the use of the term St. Martin in terms of the full word spelling or the abbreviation. That is indeed something to be adjusted in the toelichting of the law. And then the Member of Parliament stated about the fact that legislation and drafting legislation is not easy, and it's not the intention that Members of Parliament should be the ones drafting legislation, but rather the government. I fully disagree with the Member of Parliament on this. I don't think that just because it's difficult or just because we have some technical challenges here in doing it, that means that we should forego drafting legislation. As many people know, I've been very active in that, and it's because there are some things that I see as quick wins. So there are some things that where you can make a very simple amendment to a law and it can have big impact. But there are also deeper legislation where, for example, the right to basic bank accounts and banking reform, yes, that is something that is probably beyond the scope of a Member of Parliament like myself. However, what I aim to do, and that was something that he suggested, so this be sent to the Legal Affairs Department. Yes, in some cases, I have done that. With the banking legislation, we passed a motion, that draft was gone to the central bank, then to Legal Affairs, now on its way to Parliament. Is it officially an initiative of mine? No. But I'm not concerned with that, about the credit or having my name on it. I'm concerned about the fact that the legislation enters into force because of something that I started. That's what's important for the people. So for me, whatever form of legislative trajectory we use, whatever we can do, it helps. I believe, if I can use the example from MP Peterson's faction, where they believe that changes needed to be made to the curtains in the voting bureau. It wasn't just, let's say, well, we're going to just ask the government to do it. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they drafted the LBHAM with the articles of how it should look. So even though it's not the competency of Parliament, that's an example of what we're supposed to do. So on the one hand, to say, well, it's not our competency, but there are examples of where we choose when to be able to use that competency. So that is something that I just can't agree with the Member of Parliament on that. This method has worked for me very well. Some legislation, it's going to work. Others are going to need further review, and that's going to be my modus operandi for as long as I'm a Member of Parliament. Wait, I got lost here. Yes, so the technical issues were addressed. Yeah. And then back to MP De Weaver, she had an additional question about whether the number of exemptions being granted also counts, for example, for ice cream parlors, because she knows for a fact that they don't open past 12. Well, actually, if we look at the regulation, if an ice cream parlor closes at 11, they would actually be operating under an exemption as well. So even some of those businesses that you think are more benign, if they want to open past those hours, they still need an exemption. So this law does still allow for those exemptions to happen for those, for example, the ice cream parlor in Maho, or the one Carousel in Simpson Bay that does open past those hours. They would have an exemption to be able to do so. Also, the Member of Parliament felt that it was misleading to state that the number of businesses in the presentation includes the nightlife sector. It could include others. No, that is actually not the case, because the 789 businesses that I referred to in the presentation are indeed all bars and nightclubs that open past midnight. That was a question that was posed actually to her when she was Minister of TIAT. So the 789 businesses I referred to are indeed the number of businesses that apply for such a license, and 30% of them, the 30% are the ones that are allowed to open past midnight. And I think we're almost done. MP William Marlin also commented about the point regarding last call for alcohol, which I did mention earlier. I did try in my original draft to do so, but that is an example of where I do heed the advice as much as possible of the Council of Advice. It is indeed something there where you kind of have an idea as a Member of Parliament, you want to put something in law, but unfortunately it doesn't work out. Well, it's not to just have tunnel vision and say, well, I'm going to do it anyway. It was to say, no, we would leave that part out. And then there was an additional question from MP Westcott Williams about, I just had one there that I missed. Yes, that the legislation already, some of the things that I had in the original draft of the law, some of those things the law already allows for. And I think the Member of Parliament is absolutely correct. For example, one of the things I had in the original legislation was to allow, in the event of hurricanes and so on, to be able to close businesses. But actually, indeed, I believe it's Article 25 or 27. Sorry that I don't have that right in front of me. But that was an example of where it is already something that is allowed within the law. So my response to that was to remove it. So that aspect within the law was removed. As a general comment, the version that is being debated by the members of parliament today is much different than the original law. Now again, thanks to the comments from the members of parliament, I have now committed to making some additional changes because in the initiative process, this is not my law, this will be parliament's law, and I take the comments, questions, and concerns of the members of parliament very seriously. I want to sincerely thank those members that have pointed out those suggestions, such as the 3 a.m. as opposed to 5 a.m., such as the facade of the building. All of these different suggestions, the technical amendments have been very well received, and I will be before the public meeting implementing those changes. So if there are further questions, concerns, or anything else I can do to make this legislation more in line with what the members of parliament believe would best serve the people of St. Martin, I am absolutely open to that, Mr. Chairman. Thanks once again to the members of parliament, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, MP Bryson, for your answers to the questions posed by members of parliament. And I see there's additional need for more questions because I see a list of MPs already on the screen. But before I move into that, I would like to acknowledge that we had received notice of absence from MP Marlin, MP Ludmila D. Weaver, and MP Rayon Peterson. And on the list, I see MP Angelique Rumo. MP Angelique Rumo, you have the floor.
Pleasant good afternoon to you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our colleague, MP Bryson, for your presentation and for the answers given. Pleasant good afternoon to my colleagues here as well, and to the viewing and listening public. I have a question that was actually posed by a restaurant owner who asked the question, what happens with restaurants who already are able to open past midnight, with this legislation? Because if you put a cap, they're concerned because they already are able to open until 4 in the AM hours. So they would like to know what is the intention by putting a cap if they already have a license that has been granted that allows them to stay open past a certain hour. That is my question. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, MP Angelique Rumo. The next person I see is MP Melissa Gums. MP Gums, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to you and everyone again. Thank you to MP Bryson for responding to the questions and for taking into consideration the suggestions that I had made. I just had one more question, I guess, as a future think. If the MP believes that maybe as this legislation continues to evolve, there should be a separation made between fully indoor, fully outdoor, and hybrid establishments. Because I want to stress on that point that, there are those that have tested their limit in the past with whether they were permitted or not to open past opening hours. At some point in time, we have to, I think, as a people say, okay, if you're fully outdoor, maybe you shouldn't even be open till 3 a.m. In most countries, you're not allowed to. Even in the Netherlands, if there was an outdoor party happening, there is a cap for when that has to stop. Even Pride, at a certain point in time, you have to cut the music. I think by even like 9 p.m. And if fully indoor, you can keep the party going. But if you are outdoor, a hybrid establishment, your outdoor section has to be closed, and then you can only have the party indoors, which then changes, of course, the capacity, the amount of people you can let in, etc. So just if the MP could just share his thoughts on that particular question. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Gums. The next person is MP Sarah Westcott Williams. MP Sarah, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon to the colleague presenter here this afternoon on this draft law. Good afternoon to all tuned in to this meeting. Mr. Chairman, I listened to the responses and understood that the draft before us now is an amended draft to what we originally received. And getting now to the point regarding stakeholders consultation, question to the initiative taker, what about residents? Has any, and I know that's difficult, it's not as if you have a group of residents sitting somewhere that you can go to, but following the first presentation on this draft law, we saw many comments being made by residents. And so I asked of the initiative taker if any type of feedback in any which fashion was had from residents in different areas. That's one question. Does the government have a policy, a general policy regarding business opening hours in general? So for example, that by 3, 4 a.m., we don't go beyond that. Or is it completely open? And if, like just recently, I saw a request in the papers as put forward by the ministry for 24/7 opening, a restaurant, 24/7. That's a request of 3-4 days ago, maybe a day or two longer. So, but is there, when it comes to the, of course I understand you have, the proposal is for extended opening hours based on what is current, based on what is practice. And then, of course, the exemption clause still remains. So the minister can, even if those who are supposed to close at 12, they can send in a request for an exemption and to close later. But again, does the government have a general policy? So if restaurants then start to ask for, we want to open until 2 o'clock, is there some kind of cutoff, or it's just, no, we go and whatever they're asking for exemptions, it will be granted? Is there some type of basis on which, maybe the locations where they are, for the government's policy? So is there a policy of government regarding opening hours in general? There is this document, Mr. Chairman, called Residential Economic Policy. Now, this residential economic policy is a policy of 2009. Nevertheless, it was referenced to by the Minister of TIAT in his last appearance here in Parliament, meaning that, according to government, and I stand to be corrected, this is still the applicable policy. So, question to MP Bryson, in his research towards this draft initiative law, has that matter come up? The residential economic policy. Now, while the name could be a little confusing, it's actually limiting economic activity in residential areas. So what is the government doing with that policy, and has it any effect on what we're discussing now? Or can it have any effect on what we're discussing now? The issue of noise pollution. And of course, I get what the proposal is, that the ministry will, or the government really, because if we're talking a national decree containing general measures, it is a decision, a decree of the government. But I think I've seen some proposals for this noise limit in the draft before us, and based on different countries, etc., etc. Does the initiative taker have any idea, has he received any indication from the ministry regarding this, this proposal for the regulation of noise pollution caps? From the government itself. And does the government have the apparatus, or do they not have it yet, And if they do have it, can we have a test case done in order to hear it ourselves as members of parliament is a question that I also want to put with the initiative taker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just those few additional questions.
Thank you, MP Sarah Westcott Williams. The next person is MP George Pantherplet. MP George, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to the chair, Okrifir, my colleagues in Parliament, of course, in particular the initiative taker, those who are viewing. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the presenter for the information that has been provided. Again, it also still allow me to be a little repetitious in certain points that I'll bring forward. Mr. Chairman, something that we must take into consideration is the issue of culture. Culture, and I'll kind of back up and then get to maybe one or two questions, and then that would suffice. So, Chairman, my colleague, the speaker before me, mentioned a very important fact which I noted down, and they said it before I had a chance to do so, is the issue of residential and I'll add this business. Because one of the realities for St. Martin, being a small island, is that because of the zoning plan, and if I'm incorrect, not being in place, you have a business, then a residence, then a business, and then residence. You have businesses actually that should not have been allowed to operate in a residential area. But that's the reality. We could talk about measuring, whatever, that's not going to work. And let me just tie it into the noise pollution also. Where I live presently, my neighbor's about 100 feet, maybe 150 feet close to me. But when they, and I am happy they don't do it all the time, but sometimes at 5:36 at evening, they put on their music. And Mr. Chairman, I can hear the words loud and clear. Sometimes I got to try to close certain rooms because why? It is point, and I'm saying, but if you want to play music, play it for yourself. Play it for yourself. Unfortunately, or maybe also fortunately, St. Martin's population has grown so much that it has put a pressure on the law enforcement, because back in the day when I called the police officer or whatever, within 10, 15 minutes they're there and music would stop. But today, our poor law enforcement officers don't have the capacity to do that to you. But again, it has to do with behavior. So how do we manage that? The matter of the exemption, my question to you, Mr. Chairman, would be, again, it puts pressure on inspectors to control, because my question would be, yes, they have exemption. Is it a written exemption? Number one. Secondly, is it exemption that is valid for the time that the license exists, or is it every year you have to request exemption? I do not know how that goes. You know, how does that work? And how long does it take for those exemptions to be given? And at present, there are establishments who close beyond the time, but how do we know? How does government know whether they have received exemptions, yes or not? Kind of some supermarkets go up to 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, they're open still, while others close 9, 9:30. Do they already have exemptions? Who is controlling to ensure that, yes, they do have those exemptions? That again puts pressure on the on inspection in order to ensure that this happens. Mr. Chairman, again, I want to thank the presenter, but again, the issue is now, how do we control human behavior? Because as I said, some people feel that once they're playing their music, no matter who their neighbors are, they can put it as loud as they want, and be careful, because you go talk to them, then it can cause problems. Where they want to tell you, it's my house, yes, but your freedom ends where you just start infringing mine. And I think I should come home and relax myself peacefully without you putting on your music loud enough to hurt my eardrums and so on while I'm trying to rest myself. So how do we deal with that? You see, that's the reality. Do we issue a fine to them? You see, again, you know, and it's good to be trying to balance these things, but the real world makes it very difficult, because, again, it all goes back to human behavior. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, MP George. The next person is MP Gums. MP Gums, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I feel MP Pantaflet's pain from where I live as well. MP Bryson, apologies, but I missed their answer on restaurants becoming clubs kind of after they close their kitchen. If you could repeat it, because I thought I might have a clarification on that. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Gums, and I don't see any more members of parliament want any more clarity. So I will look to my right. MP Bryson, are you ready or you need some time? Ready to go? All right, MP Bryson, you have the floor.
Gotta lead by example, you know. Whatever I could do, Mr. Chairman, because MP Gums may have a clarification to that question. So if I can start with her last question first, and if she has a clarification, then I can handle it right away. But my answer to the question was, and that was a question both by MP De Weaver and MP Gums, that restaurants playing music, so-called becoming clubs. In my view, I don't, if you term it restaurants becoming clubs, well, then of course I would say no. But restaurants providing entertainment past their hours or kind of changing the format of their business, what I will say is I understand why. They are trying to compete. They are trying to be able to remain attractive. They are trying to get that extra table at the 10, 11, 12 o'clock. And one of the things that pulls those people is the entertainment aspect. So as my solution to that would be, fine if you want to provide that entertainment, but here's a national decree that says if you're going to do that and you start pounding music too loud and you're disturbing your surroundings, you're going to get a warning, you're going to get a fine, you're going to get closed down. So I don't want to stunt the growth of the industry that is transitioning to that, where people are starting more restaurants indeed, or have their ladies' night and this weekend, or maybe even every night, starting to offer such a product. In my personal opinion, I don't think we should stunt it. I think we should control it. So I don't know if...
Thank you, MP Bryson. MP Gums, is that clear or you have some clarity on that? Okay. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So then I would ask, this particular law then would then still require those restaurants to request an extra exemption. Because, for example, there's a business across the street from a place that MP Bryson and I have seen each other at, which is Lotus, that now is a restaurant. And when the kitchen closes, it's a full-on club. People are out in the streets. It's created a dangerous situation where cars are double parking both lanes of our road. And then, of course, further down the Simpson Bay Strip, as I mentioned in the original instance of this meeting, before we went on recess, dancehall artist Conscience had a whole concert at a restaurant across from Hilton Vacation Suite. So that, I think, is where I was going with my initial, asking this question initially. At what point, you know, do you then say, well, enough is enough, kind of, in that regard? Because then you have, like I said, restaurants that are existing across from hotels, in residential areas, etc., becoming full-on nightclubs, open air, and that takes me back then to my question that I believe the MP will answer as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Gums. I see MP George. Do you have a question pertaining to the same point or a new question? Similar to this?
No, it's a different question.
So let me just give to MP Bryson to answer that clarity, and then we go back to you. MP Bryson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So first of all, regardless of whether the way I understand the licensing ordinance works, if their business license says restaurant, food, and drink, they still would have to request an amendment to their license. So that's a separate process that's not really governed in this legislation. That's more to do with the business license process. So even your articles of incorporation, your chamber registration, all of that has to have the purpose of entertainment added to it. So that's where you would see in the publication when that amendment goes out, where someone wants to change their license to add entertainment. What my position is that we should allow that, but I think we should limit it. There are other factors that indeed the MP mentioned. Okay, now you're talking if there's a high concentration of this, then you have to think not just the noise pollution, which I do think we would be able to effectively control with these new standards that we will put into place. But indeed, this now also has to do with another issue that I don't think is really limited to restaurants and nightclubs. I think there's just a sort of an issue of business in general, maybe more so of a vrummy issue where a license is given for a building is given for 100 tables to sit, but then they got 2 parking spots. That's something is an overall direction I think the country has to keep in mind. That if somebody is building a commercial location, it should be pretty clear that there's sufficient parking, that there's sufficient length from the side of the road. I know actually of, I would say a bit of an unfortunate situation where somebody wanted to kind of have a food truck, and they were told that, oh, it's too close to the road. But then you go right down the road, and there's a business that's right up to the road. So a vendor can't be, let's say, 5 feet from the road, right there in Simpson Bay. But then you go a little further down, and this business that's actually physically there is right up to the road. And that's where I keep coming back to the sort of discretion, where there's no rule for one, rule for all. Sometimes, for some reason, somebody is granted that permission, and then somebody comes with a little vendor, want to sell tacos or whatever, and then he's told, no, you can't be there close to the road. And I'm trying as much as possible to change the philosophy within this legislation that it should not be just the minister decide, and there should be dialogue with the individual where they have some sort of appeal to say, Minister, respectfully, I don't agree with you, and here's why. So coming back to that point, I think this goes beyond maybe the Ministry of TIAT. I think if at least what I've seen too doesn't have not so much only to do with the businesses, but those guys on the scooters on the side of the road and just hanging out. That is also more a judicial thing that I think the algemene politieker, where that has to be enforced from a safety perspective, the road perspective. One thing I want to say, also a place that we both frequent, but something I've frequently asked, I think there needs to be, a lot of people ain't gonna like it, but from my personal experience, there needs to be not a huge speed bump, but some type of speed bump on that road. Because we've seen accidents happen there. Yes, is it gonna cause more traffic during the day? I don't know. I'm not a traffic expert, but what I do know, at night, that road becomes a highway. And people speeding, and now that it's becoming a more built-up area, you have Tap and Still, you have this one, you have that one. That's great. That's good for the economy. That's now the Miami of St. Martin. Fine. But my worry is the roads, the bikes, and the cars going down there. That's an example of something where legislatively I can't do much. That's a decision the government have to take and say, listen, let's explore whether, not one of those huge hills, but a nice little speed bump with some signage, what you call it, a crosswalk, that at least there's some indication to drivers, hey, take it easy, don't be speeding on that road, because we've known people who have close to lose their lives on that intersection there. Should I continue with the answers? Yeah?
No.
Oh.
I think MP George has a question,
Okay.
so add up, and then you can continue with all the answers.
I'm ready to
MP George, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not really a question, basically a remark. Well, no, it's a question, yes. The issue of the noise pollution, what about the vehicles? Because, I don't know about you, Mr. Chairman, but there are times when I just couldn't get out of the traffic fast enough because the music that was in the vehicle behind you or in front of you, you could feel your vehicle, shaking. Mr. Chairman, concerning the issue of the speed bumps, and I close with this remark, it's amazing, again, how much government, parliament have to try to do in order to curb people's behavior. You got to put extra speed bumps now because people are using it as a racing trip. And Mr. Chairman, I better put 20 speed bumps and just made them drive slower than that. It is crazy. People have to learn to be responsible, Mr. Chairman, for their behavior, but unfortunately, that's not the real world. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, MP George. Now I see MP Bryson. You can go on with your answers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll go back to MP Ramu's question about, and this is very important. So any restaurant that has a current exemption will this law affect them in any way? No, this law will not affect them in the sense that now their exemptions are null and void. As a matter of fact, what this legislation, however, does do, which doesn't currently exist, if they have an exemption to operate past the hour that the law says, before a minister could, to put it bluntly, wake up tomorrow and say, "Dear sir, your license now changed from 1 a.m. to 11. They have full legal authority to be able to do so, and there's no recourse for the business as far as I know, other than maybe going to court and then a sort of reasoned decision by a judge is made. What we've added now is that if there's a change to a time that has been granted by the ministry, the person has 4 weeks to be able to be heard. The term "be heard" is used because I can't say that if the person objects, then it can't be done. We have to allow the ministry to do their business. But like I mentioned earlier, if a minister comes and wants to make an exemption, a change to your law, and you don't agree, you have the chance to be heard, and then you have a stronger ability that if your reasoning is very good and you believe so, you can proceed to the ombudsman, for example, if you think you were treated unfairly from a governmental perspective, or you have then the legal recourse to say, I've even shown my objection as per this new version of the law, and I was ignored, or I wasn't answered, or I wasn't taken into account. And then that gives the restaurants, for example, more security to know that if you're going to, if the government is going to change your operating hours, they have to make that a very serious and well-motivated decision, as opposed to how it can be done now, where there's no need for motivation or accountability. So no, for those of you that has licenses out there, this law doesn't change anything in terms of what you currently have. It just strengthens your rights to hopefully remain with what you already have. MP Gums, about the fully indoor, fully outdoor establishments, I think that is something that the national decree that would come from this legislation should include. It is something that kind of is addressed in the residential economic policy mentioned by MP Westcott Williams, which I'll go into in a little bit more. In the sense that the residential economic policy, which is, I struggle to use the term because it's a recognized policy, but I don't know if it's published, and it's tough, you know? And that's again what tells me we shouldn't have to debate it like this as parliamentarians. This thing should be set, either a decree or a national decree or something where it's clear. That clarity isn't quite there from the rep. It's used, it's on the government website, and that's as far as I can say. But that one does make a distinction between built residential areas and mixed residential areas. What we should probably do, and one of the recommendations I think to the government with this legislation, should be to then maybe establish whether fully indoor and mixed or fully outdoor should have a different regulation. That, from what I see, what we can do with this legislation is that that can go into the national decree. A question about whether I have met with residents. This was MP Westcott Williams. I particularly chose to meet with residents in Simpson Bay, Maho, and Cole Bay, because in the presentation I had shown a sort of a map based on the locations of where people have the most exemptions and where most noise complaints come in. Those are the areas that get the most noise complaints, especially the Simpson Bay, well, technically it's Cole Bay, but let's say what we call Kimsha. That strip there has had an increasing number of noise complaints. One of the things the ministry did point out, however, is that initially they were looking at the noise complaints as a sort of an area, or a particular business, but when they really looked at it closely, part of the problem has been people that park their cars in the Kimsha parking lot and they blast music. Not to say that sometimes others haven't exceeded, but that is now an additional dimension that unfortunately this law would not cover. This law deals with the license holders. As a matter of fact, even the vendors that are on Kimsha, they have a vending permit, so they don't fall under the vergoeding Landsverordening. But the national decree that would be created could cover different businesses. So that to say that, yes, residents have actually told me that in the past it was much worse in terms of getting businesses to sort of make adjustments. One such business that used to get a lot of complaints in the past that they mentioned, but they have come a long way, they say, is the Soggy Dollar Bar, where a whole revamp of their sound system was made in such a way that The sound is much more directional, higher quality speakers where it's loud enough to hear in the location, but it does not boom across the water or into Simpson Bay as much as before. So that also kind of applies to Coal Bay. The Maho area, maybe not so much residents, but the hotel has some challenges there. And again, that has more to do not with the opening times, but the sound levels. And the challenge has again been, what is the sound level? What is considered too loud? So now with this legislation, it will be clear. You stand 30 meters away or to the nearest facade, you pull out your decibel meter, and if it says, if we follow the rep, 85 decibels higher, you are in violation. Does a general business opening hours policy exist? The only other one that I was able to find was the Winkelsluiting Landsverordening, and that is an interesting thing. Again, I don't know what the legislators were thinking back then when we created this vergunningslandsverordening and then the Winkelsluiting that has some crossover, but I do not know of a general policy or law overarching whether we can have 24-hour business or not. The uitzondering Landsverordening, it's called, that more deals with if there's an emergency to be able to close all businesses. But I was not able to find, if it is, then I'm not aware of it, unfortunately, but I can look at that. But the only other ordinance I found was the Winkelsluiting Landsverordening, and that one is actually the one that is used when there's holidays and so on, where businesses need to close. It is actually the Winkelsluiting Landsverordening and not the vergunningslandsverordening that is used. Is the rep applicable policy? It is in use by the government, but so is the enforcement policy. So there's the 2009 rep and there's the 2016 enforcement policy. They are two different policies that handle different things, but there's an aspect that they have in common, which is sound levels. And like I mentioned, what is in the rep versus what is in the enforcement policy are very different. And that is why I've, with this legislation, pushed for a single policy by national decree that deals with all of these businesses in terms of noise pollution. What we envision is in the aspects of the rep, what I would envision is, I looked at the residential economic policy, I've discussed it with some businesses, and they do think it's pretty reasonable. If you look at page 10 of the rep, they have two sets of sound levels, one for an establishments within a, so they have basically mixed residential versus non-mixed residential in terms of how loud they can go. You have a range from 60 to 75 decibels for the residential area, and then it goes as high as 95 to 110 decibels within a mixed area with permission to keep dance and or live music. So I would envision that something like this, whatever numbers, that can be done with the stakeholder consultations and how far the ministry is already working on this. So I think this is something that the members of parliament can look forward to getting from the government once before it goes into effect. MP George Pantoflet, how do we manage human behavior? I think that is indeed an interesting question and a constant quagmire of any government, where on the one hand, you can't say you're going to completely control people's behaviors, but that's the reason why we have penal systems, we have legislative systems, because we do need to guide our public into what we believe is acceptable behavior within our society. I believe that this noise pollution legislation properly guides our society into what is acceptable. If businesses can all abide by this, and now there's an even playing field where everybody understands, listen guys, we know we're gonna get shut down or closed down if we exceed 90 decibels, then the playing field is even. Not that, well, all of us on the strip allowed to be 80 decibels, but that one guy over there for some reason is allowed to do 110 decibels. Then what happens, there's a temptation in order to compete that everybody else is going to want to do the 110 just like he has. So evening the playing field, I think, will encourage businesses to abide by the law. And then perhaps that can trickle down into our society, that it's understood that we have a standard within our business community, and hopefully those in cars and homes and so on can do it. And perhaps the government should consider going further into this as a sort of a national policy in general. The exemptions in terms of control, he commented that that can make it challenging. Indeed, that has been challenges where, for example, maybe on record when the inspector calls his office to try to find out, hey, what's the exemption this person have? On file, maybe they have one thing, the restaurant has something else, there's a whole discussion of, no, I allowed to do this, I allowed to open till 2. No, but on our file, we see you have to open till 1. No, last week I just picked up my new business license, maybe you all don't have it yet. You know, the exemptions does add a certain layer of complication when it comes to enforcement. And by means of this, hopefully now there will be less of those situations. And the question about vehicles, no, that would not be covered by this legislation. And no, we can't legislate the behavior as was pointed out earlier. Mr. Chairman, with that, I think I've answered all the questions from the members of Parliament.
Thank you, MP Bryson. Is there a need for additional questions, deliberation on this ordinance? I don't see anyone. So if there are no further questions for the initiative taker, a report on this draft national ordinance will be sent to the initiative taker and the government. I want to thank initiative taker MP Rolando Bryson for his presence here today and for providing the necessary information. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this agenda point 2. Regarding agenda point 1, this meeting remains adjourned until further notice. Yes, MP Bryson.
Just for me to confirm so that I know what I need to do next, you're adjourning, this agenda point is closed, so then okay, thank you, because I think I need to.
Agenda point 2 will be closed, agenda point 1
remains
is
open.
adjourned because the minister has
Yes,
to come
correct.
to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So the agenda point 1 remains adjourned until further notice. I thank you all for your participation and I hereby adjourn this meeting. Meeting adjourned.